Salacious History discusses sex, romance, and many other topics that are intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Salacious History, the podcast that explores moments in history that were shaped by sex, romance, and people who were generally down to clown. I'm your host, Sarah Duncan. On today's episode, we are doing another historical cross-section of sex and marriage. This time around, we're exploring sex and marriage among enslaved Africans during the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically those who were brought to America. Because this is a sensitive topic, I do have a few disclaimers before we begin. 1. This episode discusses rape and other violence towards women, men, and children. Listener discretion is advised. And 2. I'm very aware of the fact that I am a white woman recounting the atrocities that were carried out against enslaved Africans at the hands of other white people. I have worked very hard to ensure that I give a historically accurate account, and if there are any errors in my reporting, I assure you they were unintentional and I will happily accept corrections via email. Okay, here we go. Let's start with a very brief overview to give the historical context for today's topic. The Transatlantic slave trade was a global trade movement that spanned from the 16th century to the 19th century. During this time, between 10 million and 12 million Africans were captured and brought from their native lands to the Americas. Slavery in the American colonies began in 1619, when a Dutch ship brought 20 enslaved Africans to the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. The largest influx of enslaved peoples was during the 18th century. Historians estimate that nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the transatlantic slave trade took place during this time. European settlers began to prefer enslaved Africans for their labor force, who were cheaper and more plentiful than indentured servants from Europe. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, enslaved Africans helped build the new American nation into an economic powerhouse through the production of high-demand crops, such as cotton and tobacco. After the American Revolution, most of the nation's slave population was contained within the southern states, which relied on the enslaved workforce for their agricultural industries. Enslaved Africans were not considered U.S. citizens, and therefore had almost no rights or protections under U.S. law. Cruelty toward enslaved Africans began even before they arrived in the Americas. Physical and sexual abuse of captured Africans was widespread on the vessels that brought them across the Atlantic Ocean. The only thing mitigating this cruel treatment was the monetary value each slave represented. Captives that arrived looking visibly healthy were likely to fetch a higher price at auction. Slave auctions were a truly grotesque operation. Captive Africans were stripped naked, oiled down, and poked and prodded by potential buyers, much as if they were inspecting a horse they wished to purchase. There was nothing stopping potential buyers from groping or molesting the women in these circumstances. It was inherent in the slave trade that white masters had claim to their slaves' bodies. While slavery was a hellish experience for both black men and women, slave owners' exploitation of black women's sexuality was a particular brand of torture that women were forced to endure. Even though much of this episode will focus on the crimes committed against women, it should be noted that, in some cases, white men also sexually abused young enslaved girls and boys as well. It is important to understand the perception of black women during this time. During the slavery period, black women were thought to be innately lustful and sinful beings. The ideal 19th century white woman was pure and chaste, even to the point of being prudish. In contrast, Enslaved black women were viewed as hypersexual beings, always available and always desiring sex. This made them both the object of man's loathing and his wildest fantasy. Under this premise, some argued that black women could not be raped because they were never not consenting to sex. F***ing disgusting. Ironically, when most Southerners were worried about rape, both before and after emancipation, the only thing that crossed their minds was the threat of black men raping white women. This inaccurate stereotype that black men were rapists was used to excuse countless lynchings. Within the bonds of slavery, masters often felt they had the right to engage sexually with their enslaved women. Enslaved females would sometimes permit these advances in the hope of gaining favor with their master, which could increase the chances of them or their children being freed. Unfortunately, most of the time, slave owners engaged in sex by force. For the most part, masters made young, unwed slaves the objects of their sexual advances. However, it was not out of the realm of possibility for them to rape married women as well. Let me make one thing clear before we go any further. Whether or not these women appeared to consent to these sexual advances or not, they were all victims of rape and exploitation. It's not really consent if you're only saying yes in order to stay alive. Masters would use rape as a tool to terrorize both enslaved males and females. Rape of married women added the additional cruelty of forcing their husbands to stand by and do nothing while their wives became victims. Interference or retaliation from husbands could have deadly consequences. Because of this inability to act on behalf of their wives, black men were sometimes grateful when they were not allowed to live with their partners. Former slave Henry Bibb wrote, quote, "If my wife must be exposed to the insults and licentious passions of wicked slave drivers and overseers, heaven forbid that I should have to be compelled to witness the sight." Unquote. Most slaveholders were already married. Their interest in and sexual relations with their enslaved women would often result in tension and hatred between enslaved women and the mistress of the house. Wives who were powerless to stop their husband's adultery could take out their anger on the captive women he showed interest in. A heart-wrenching example of this type of toxic triangle is described in Solomon Northup's memoir, 12 Years a Slave. Owners were not the only sexual predators that enslaved women had to worry about. Other so-called partners, that's using the term very loosely, could include the master's sons, visitors of the slaveholder's family, neighboring planters, and hired workers. It was not unheard of for captives to fight back against sexual assaults, although many died resisting their attackers. Those who survived their attacks carried physical and psychological scars from what they had endured, as well as the fear of being attacked again. In addition to the immediate sexual gratification of raping an enslaved female, masters also benefited from the possibility of gaining an additional slave if he impregnated her. According to Virginian law in 1662, the social status of a child was based on his or her mother. In other words, any child born to an enslaved woman was to become a slave as well, no matter who the father was. It was an open secret of slavery that masters often counted their own illegitimate children among their slaves. There were occasions when those so-called mulatto children looked almost identical to their owner's white children. Some white fathers freed their illegitimate children or sent them to the north to be educated. Sadly, most were doomed to the same fate as all other children born into slavery. By 1860, over 10% of the enslaved population was mulatto. Something that became more common during the 1800s was slave breeding. Slave breeding refers to the practice of slave owners that were meant to influence the reproduction of slaves in order to increase the profit and wealth of slaveholders. Strategic breeding practices were motivated in part by the 1808 federal ban on the importation of enslaved Africans. With a limited pool of slave labor, owners now had to rely on breeding rather than the importation of Africans to increase their labor force. Slave breeding involved forced sexual relations between male and female slaves, as well as forced intercourse between a master and his enslaved women, for the purposes of producing slave children. Slave children were generally considered ready to work and leave home when they were just 12 years old. Even if a slaveholder did not intend to force breeding among his slaves, he could still achieve the desired result by threatening to use force if needed. The fear produced by even the possibility of forced breeding was real and widespread. Childbearing started around the age of 13 for most enslaved women. By age 20, most enslaved females would be expected to have 4 or 5 children. To encourage childbearing, some slaveholders promised females their freedom after they produced 15 children. Holy cow! There are some reports of enslaved men who were known as stockmen. These were male slaves who had strong traits that owners wanted to pass on to the next generation. These stockmen were essentially treated as studs and were expected to lay with and impregnate many women. While these stockmen may have received preferential treatment from their owners, they were generally despised by captive men and women alike. There was also a class of enslaved females called fancy maids. These women were sold at auction to become concubines, which was generally called the fancy trade. Notably, concubine slaves were the only enslaved women who sold for higher prices than skilled male slaves. Rape and assault in the Old South fell within the framework of white supremacy that ruled social relations. Although the rape of any woman was illegal, few white men would have been tried for their crimes. Even fewer would actually be convicted. Trials of white rapists were generally limited to the rape or abuse of African American girls under the age of 12. Southern rape laws were infused with race-based double standards. A black man accused of rape could be put to death, but a white man could generally rape and abuse enslaved females without fear of punishment. Free or white women could charge their attackers with rape, but enslaved women had no legal recourse. Although life was infinitely better for white women, all women during this time in history, whether black or white, were viewed as the property of men.